They left me for dead once, and I let the world believe I'd stayed dead inside ever since. But it was a 6-year-old girl with cookie crumbs on her fingers who proved, on a 14-hour flight to Seoul, that the coldest men in the underworld could still be broken open by something as small as a whisper in her sleep. I want to start with a question, because I think you deserve the chance to answer it before I tell you what happened to me. What would you do if a stranger's child fell asleep against your shoulder and murmured the word "Daddy," and you knew, the instant you heard it, that it wasn't a mistake? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're the kind of person who believes broken things can still be put back together, stay with me because this is a story about exactly that. My name is Tyran Han. I was 32 years old the day my life split into a before and an after, and I was sitting in seat 2A of Korean Air Flight 081, wearing a black tailored suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. My collar was buttoned high enough to hide most of the ink that climbed the side of my neck, though it never hid all of it. Underneath that suit, tattoos covered my chest and both arms, a record of every war one had survived and every man I had failed to save. Most strangers who looked at me didn't notice the tattoos first. They noticed my eyes. Cold, unreadable, the kind of eyes that made grown men lower their voices without knowing why. To the world, I was the chief executive of Han Sterling Group, a luxury holding company with glass towers in Seoul, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. To a much smaller circle, I was something else entirely. I ran one of the most feared underground organizations in South Korea, an empire my late father had built with his bare hands and his own blood, and one my mother, a woman everyone called Madame Han, had spent 3 decades protecting with a ruthlessness that never once looked ruthless from the outside. 5 years before that flight, 3 bullets had nearly ended my life on a rain-soaked street outside a warehouse in Incheon. I woke from a coma that swallowed 6 weeks of my existence to find the only woman I had ever loved gone, my chest hollowed out, and a silence inside me that no amount of money could ever fill again. I hadn't smiled since. Not once, not really. My 4 bodyguards sat in the row behind me that morning, and the seat beside me stayed empty, because my assistant had purchased it specifically so no one could occupy it. I liked silence on long flights. Silence let me think. Silence let me work. Silence did not last. A flight attendant's voice drifted toward me from the aisle, soft and apologetic. "Sweetheart, your seat is back there." I didn't look up from my tablet at first. I had trained myself years ago not to react to noise that didn't concern me. Then a small voice answered, clear and completely unbothered by the tone meant to correct her. "I know where my seat is. I just don't want to sit in it." I looked up. A little girl stood at the edge of my row in a bright yellow hoodie, white sneakers with the laces double knotted, and denim overalls with a small paint stain near one pocket. Her hair was styled into 2 neat puffs, and she carried a backpack covered in stickers of cartoon foxes. She studied me the way children study something they haven't decided is safe or dangerous yet, curious, unafraid, entirely unimpressed by the 4 large men sitting behind me. "Is this seat taken?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "By who?" "By me. I bought both seats." She tilted her head at that with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. "That's silly. You only have 1 body." One of my men, a wide-shouldered soldier named Ha Jun, made a sound behind me that could have been a cough and could have been a laugh. He swallowed at the last second. The flight attendant tried again, gentler this time. "Honey, please, your mommy's asleep a few rows back. Let's not bother the gentleman." "I'm not bothering him," the girl said without missing a beat. "I'm asking him a question." "That's different." I almost smiled. Almost. "Sit down," I said, mostly to end the conversation rather than to invite her into it. She climbed into the seat like she'd been granted entry to a palace, buckled her own belt, settled her backpack on her lap, and turned to study me with the same open curiosity she'd greeted me with a moment earlier. "Why do you look angry even when you're drinking orange juice?" she asked. I hadn't touched the orange juice. It sat untouched on my tray beside a coffee I also hadn't touched. "I'm not angry," I told her. "Your face says otherwise." "My face does a lot of things without my permission." She laughed, short and surprised. like she hadn't expected me to say anything worth laughing at. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tyran. I'm Yun." "No, wait." She caught herself, frowning at her own mistake. "I'm not supposed to use my friend's name. I'm Hyle." "Hyle," I repeated. "That's a pretty name." "I know. My mom picked it. She said it means summer." She reached into her backpack and produced a small packet of butter cookies, tore it open, glanced at my untouched coffee, and set one cookie carefully on the edge of my tray table, on the white linen napkin, like she was performing a small ceremony. "I think coffee tastes lonely by itself," she said, like she was sharing a great secret with me. I looked at that cookie for a long moment. It was such a small thing, a child's snack, and yet it lodged itself somewhere in my chest, underneath 5 years of silence, in a place I had assumed was permanently closed for business. "Thank you," I said quietly. "You're welcome," she said. "Don't let it go to waste. Cookies have feelings too, probably." Across the aisle and 2 rows back, a woman slept with her head against the window, a cardigan draped over her shoulders, a laptop bag tucked beneath the seat in front of her. She had been awake nearly 30 hours straight, finishing a design project before racing to catch this exact flight, and she had no idea her daughter had wandered 4 rows forward. She had no idea who was sitting beside her. Hyle kept talking. She always kept talking, I would learn later, and according to her teacher, it was both her greatest gift and the school's biggest daily challenge. "Do rich people buy happiness? Or is it free for you guys?" she asked, swinging her sneakers under the seat. "It's not free for anyone," I said. "That's sad. Most true things are." She narrowed her eyes at me like a tiny detective assembling a case, then pointed at my sunglasses folded on the tray. "Can I wear those?" "They're too big for you." "I know. That's why it'll be funny." She didn't wait for permission. She slid them on, and they slipped immediately down her nose, and she turned toward my men and struck a pose. "Look, I'm rich and scary now." My youngest soldier pressed his lips together so hard, his face went red trying not to laugh, and Hajun gave up entirely, a short laugh disguised badly as a cough. I watched my own security detail, men who had stared down armed enemies without blinking, completely undone by a 6-year-old wearing my sunglasses. "You're going to get them in trouble," I told her. "For laughing? That's not a crime." She pulled the glasses off and studied Hajun. "What's his name?" "Hajun." "No, I'm renaming him. He looks like a refrigerator with feelings," she added generously. She turned to my youngest man. "And you?" "Walking Wi-Fi," she decided instantly. "You look like you're always connected to something important." The small section of the cabin within earshot dissolved into quiet laughter, and even the senior flight attendant, a woman who had served me on 11 previous flights and never once heard me speak more than a sentence to a stranger, smiled behind her cart. Something loosened in my chest for the first time in 5 years, not fully, not even close, but enough that I noticed it happening, and that alone unsettled me more than any rival had managed in a decade. "You talk a lot," I said. "My mom says the same thing. She says I came out of the womb already explaining myself." She reached for a small sketchbook and flipped it open to a half-finished drawing of a palace with 2 windows. "Do you want to see my drawing?" "Sure. This is the palace I'm going to live in when I'm a queen," she announced proudly. "Ambitious. I learned that word last week," she said. "It means I have big plans." "It does." She flipped the page to a drawing of a woman with curly hair standing beside a tower she'd labeled, in shaky handwriting, Seoul Tower, probably. "That's my mom," she said. "We're going to Seoul because she told me amazing stories about it her whole life. She used to live there before I was born." Something tightened in my chest that I couldn't explain yet. "She lived in Seoul," I said. "Yep, for a little bit. She doesn't talk about it much. But sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep, she looks really sad about it." Hyle shrugged, the way children shrug when they've noticed something painful in an adult, but don't yet have the words for it. "I think someone broke her heart there, but she won't tell me who." I wanted to ask 100 things. "Does she ever say a name?" I managed. Hyle shook her head. "No, she just gets quiet, and then she hugs me extra long," so I stopped asking. She yawned. covering her mouth the way her mother had clearly taught her. "I'm getting sleepy. You should sit with your mother," I told her. "She's sleeping. I don't want to wake her. She worked all night." She tucked her sketchbook away and folded her hands in her lap. "Is it okay if I sit here a little longer?" I looked at her, at the stubborn set of her small jaw. So unfamiliar, and yet not unfamiliar at all. "It's okay," I said. Within minutes her eyelids grew heavy, her pencil slipped from her fingers and rolled to the floor. Her head nodded once, twice, and then, without any warning at all, she leaned sideways and rested her head against my shoulder, fast asleep. The cabin around us went still. A passing attendant paused mid-step, eyes widening. Ha-jun half rose, instinct telling him to remove the child before anything unplanned could reach me. I lifted one hand, smallest motion, and he sat back down. I looked down at the small girl sleeping against my expensive suit. Her breathing slow and even, her hand curled loosely against my arm. No one had touched me like this in 5 years. No one had been allowed close enough to try. Something cracked open in my chest, quiet, unexpected, painful in a way I couldn't name. She shifted slightly and murmured something too soft to catch. I leaned closer without thinking, just to hear it. "Daddy!" The word hit me like a blow. My pulse stopped, then slammed forward all at once. I sat frozen, staring down at a child who had no business saying a word like that near me. Children said all kinds of things in their sleep. It meant nothing. It had to mean nothing. Slowly, almost against my will, I lifted my eyes and looked across the aisle, 2 rows back, toward the sleeping woman with the cardigan over her shoulders and dark curls falling across her face. My heart stopped a second time. I knew that face. I had spent 5 years trying to forget it and failing every single night. Serafina Vale, the woman I had loved before 3 bullets and a coma stole everything from me. The woman my own mother had told me vanished, married another man, and never once looked back. She was asleep 4 seats away. And her daughter, a girl with stubborn eyes and a gift for impossible questions, had just fallen asleep on my shoulder and called me daddy. I did the math before I even wanted to. 6 years old, 5 years since the coma, 9 months before that. The numbers landed like a verdict. I sat there for the rest of the flight without moving, without speaking, feeling a decade of grief and rage rearrange itself inside my chest. By the time we began our descent into Incheon, I had already canceled every meeting scheduled for the next 3 days. I had already instructed Ha-jun to quietly pull passenger records the moment we landed. I had already decided, somewhere over the Pacific, that I would not rest until one understood exactly what had been stolen from me and exactly who had stolen it. For 5 years I had believed a lie. Now I intended to burn it to the ground. I didn't approach Serafina on the plane. I didn't say a word. Whatever truth waited for me, I needed to find it on my own terms, not in a cramped aisle with strangers watching. I watched her wake Heil gently as we taxied toward the gate. I watched her apologize, flustered, to the attendant for her daughter's wandering. I watched her take Heil's small hand and walk off the plane without ever once looking my way. She never recognized me. 5 years had changed me. The tattoos were new. The silence was new. The eyes that once looked at her with warmth now looked at the world with suspicion. I had become someone else, and she walked past that someone without a second glance. I let her go. Then I went straight to work. Han's Sterling Tower stood 38 stories above downtown Seoul, all black glass and clean lines, a monument to wealth that hid an empire built on something far less polished. I didn't go to my executive office. I went to the 7th floor, the private archive my late father had built decades earlier, the floor only 3 people on Earth had access to. I was one of them. My mother was another. I ordered it opened, every hospital record from my 6-week coma pulled, every visitor log cross-checked, every phone record from that period reviewed by my most trusted analyst, a quiet woman named Unsol who had worked for my family for over a decade and asked no questions she wasn't authorized to ask. It took 11 hours. What we found broke something in me that had already been broken once and never properly healed. The visitor logs showed Serafina had come to my hospital room 14 times during my coma. 14 times turned away at the door by hospital staff acting on instructions from my mother. Phone records showed dozens of calls from a London number blocked one by one, the orders signed under my mother's authority. A folder buried deep in the archive, dated 6 weeks after the shooting, held something that made Unsol's hands shake as she passed it to me. A letter from Serafina, unsent, intercepted before it ever reached me. I read it twice before I trusted my own eyes. She had written that she was pregnant. She had written that she loved me and would wait as long as it took. She had written that she didn't care about my world, my danger, or my family's disapproval. She only cared about me waking up. Beneath the letter sat a second document, a medical consultation note from a private clinic in London, dated 9 months before Hyle's listed birthday, confirming the pregnancy. My mother had known and said nothing. I sat in that archive for a long time, the documents spread across the table in front of me, feeling something cold settle into my chest. Not grief anymore, something sharper. I found my mother that evening in the private dining room of our family estate, sitting at the head of the table the way she always sat, spine straight, jade bracelets catching the light. A woman who had run this empire's quieter operations for 30 years. "You're back early," she said without looking up from her tea. "I assumed you'd stay in business class, hiding from your own staff for another week." "Where is she?" I asked. "Who?" "Don't," I said, sharper than I intended. "Don't do that." She set her tea down, and for the first time in years something flickered across her composed face. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of fear. "I have a daughter," I said, 6 years old. I sat next to her on a plane this morning, and she fell asleep on my shoulder and called me Daddy in her sleep, and I didn't understand why until I looked up and saw her mother sitting 2 rows back. My mother said nothing. 14 visits to that hospital," I continued. 14 times she came, and you turned her away every single time. You blocked her calls. You had a letter telling me she was pregnant, and when I woke up asking for her, you told me she abandoned me. You told me she married someone else. "I protected you," my mother said quietly. "You stole 5 years from me." "I protected this family," she said, her voice rising, the calm cracking at the edges. "Do you understand what would have happened if the Choi family or the Park Syndicate had learned you had a child with a foreign woman, a woman with no power, no protection, no name that meant anything in this world? They would have used her against you. They would have used that child against you. I saved both their lives by keeping them away from you. Hadn't allowed myself in years. You stole a child's father. You stole a woman's first love. You stole 5 years that belonged to us, not you. And you let me grieve a woman who was never gone. She would have destroyed everything we built," my mother said. "She built nothing but pain because of what you did," I told her, standing, my chair scraping hard against the floor. "I am done letting you decide who I love and who I lose." I left her sitting alone at that long table, the tea going cold, and for the first time in my adult life I didn't look back to see how she reacted. London greeted me with gray skies and a steady drizzle. Fitting weather for a man about to face the one conversation he had spent 5 years avoiding in his nightmares. Serafina lived in a narrow brick building in Clapham, 3rd floor, the kind of flat a woman builds for herself with her own 2 hands and refuses to apologize for. I stood outside her door for nearly 10 minutes before I found the nerve to knock. When she opened it, the shock on her face nearly took my breath away. She had aged exactly the way grief ages a person who refuses to let it win. Sharper around the eyes, stronger around the shoulders, more tired than she should have been at 30. "Tyran," she whispered, like saying my name might make me disappear if she said it wrong. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. 5 years collapsed into one silent stare on a rainy doorstep in South London. Then she slammed the door in my face. I stood there, rain soaking through my coat, and knocked again. "Go away," she called through the door. "I need 5 minutes." "You had 5 years," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You had 5 years and you didn't use 1 single second of them." "I didn't know," I said. I swear to you, I didn't know any of it." Silence on the other side of the door. Then, slowly, the lock turned, and she opened it just enough to look at me properly, arms crossed, eyes red. "Didn't know what?" she demanded. "That you came to the hospital, that you wrote to me, that you were pregnant." My voice broke on the last word. "I found out everything yesterday. My mother lied to both of us. She told me you abandoned me. She told you I rejected you and married someone else. None of it was true. Not one word." Her face went through something complicated, disbelief fighting against 5 years of carefully built armor. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect anything," I said. "I came because you deserve the truth whether you believe it tonight or not." I reached into my coat and pulled out copies of everything, the letter, the medical records, the visitor logs. "Read it or don't, but it's yours either way." She took the folder with trembling hands and didn't open it. "Not yet." "Yours?" "I know," I said. "I worked it out on the plane before I even knew it was you sitting 2 rows back." "She fell asleep on you," Serafina said. It wasn't a question. It was her putting pieces together in real time. Her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall in front of me. "She gave me a cookie first," I told her. "Said coffee tastes lonely by itself." A small broken laugh escaped her. "Despite everything, that sounds like her." "She's extraordinary," I said. "I only knew her for 6 hours, and I already know that." Serafina's jaw tightened. "Don't," she said. "Don't stand here being charmed by a child you abandoned for 6 years." "I never abandoned her," I said. "I never knew she existed." "You don't get to just walk back in," she said, her voice rising again. 5 years, Tyran. 5 years I raised her alone. 5 years I worked myself sick building a career so my daughter would never have to ask why we couldn't afford something. 5 years I told myself, you chose someone else over us. And I believed it, and it nearly destroyed me. And now you want to stand on my doorstep with a folder of paperwork and expect me to just... "I don't expect anything," I said again, quieter this time. "I came because it's the truth, and because she deserves to know her father exists, and never wanted to be anywhere else but with her." Serafina stared at me for a long moment, rain dripping from my hair, my coat soaked through, my eyes carrying an exhaustion that hadn't been there 5 years ago. "You should go," she finally said. "Not forever." Her voice softened, "just enough to give me something to hold on to. Just tonight. I need to think, I need to read this. I need to not look at your face for a few hours." I nodded, accepting the only mercy she had to offer me that night. "I'll come back tomorrow." "Don't bring flowers," she said as I turned to leave. "Don't bring some grand gesture. If you come back honest. That's the only thing that might work." "Honest is all I have left," I said, and walked back into the rain. I returned the next afternoon, and that conversation was louder than the first. The third visit, 2 days later, ended in tears, hers, and though I tried to hide it, my own. By the fourth visit, something had shifted from accusation into exhaustion, and exhaustion slowly gave way to an honesty neither of us had allowed ourselves in years. Hyle, naturally, had her own plans for how all of this should go. "You like him," she informed her mother on the third evening, perched on a kitchen stool while Serafina chopped vegetables with more force than the task required. "It's complicated, Hyle. Everything is complicated when grown-ups don't want to say the truth," she said. "He's my dad. You love him. He clearly still likes you because he keeps coming back even though you've slammed the door on him twice." "You counted," Serafina said. "I count everything," Hyle said, hopping off the stool. "I'm locking you two in the kitchen tomorrow." "You're doing what?" "I read that adults solve problems faster when they can't escape," she said, as if quoting a peer-reviewed study. "It's basic strategy." The next afternoon when I arrived, Hyle greeted me at the door with the seriousness of a general briefing a soldier before battle. "Go talk to my mom in the kitchen," she instructed. "I made noodles. You both have to eat them." "You made noodles?" I turned on the kettle. "Mom did the rest, but it was my idea." She pushed me gently toward the kitchen where Serafina stood, arms crossed, clearly aware of exactly what her daughter was attempting. The door clicked shut behind us. A distinct sound followed, the unmistakable click of a lock turning from the outside. "Hyle!" Serafina shouted. "You're welcome," came the muffled, cheerful reply through the door. "There's a key under the mat if it's a real emergency, but you have to talk for at least 1 hour first." Serafina looked at the locked door, then at me. Then at the 2 steaming bowls of instant noodles sitting on the small kitchen table. "She gets this from your side," she muttered. "I was never this dramatic. She gets the stubbornness from you," I said. I watched her negotiate sunglasses privileges from 4 armed men on an airplane. Despite herself, her mouth twitched. Saturday. We ate mostly in silence at first, the kind that comes after too many words have already been spoken in anger. Then Serafina took a large bite of noodles, chewed twice, and her eyes went wide with sudden panic. "Oh no, what? These are spicy, these are very spicy." She grabbed for water and gulped it down, and it did nothing. Tears started running down her face, not from sadness this time, but pure, undignified, burning distress. Against every instinct toward composure I had spent a decade building, I stood and poured her a glass of milk from the fridge, sliding it across the table without a word. She glared at me through watering eyes. "You knew. I suspected. You let me suffer." "I believed in your confidence," I said, perfectly calm. "You looked very sure of yourself when you sat down." She grabbed the nearest napkin and threw it at me. It bounced harmlessly off my chest. And then, for the first time in 5 years, we both laughed. Really laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded, the kind neither of us had allowed ourselves since the world tore us apart. On the other side of the door, Hyle pressed her ear against the wood, grinning so wide her cheeks hurt. Finally she whispered to herself and skipped off to draw a new picture in her sketchbook. This one, she decided, would have all 3 of us in it, standing in front of a palace together. Word travels fast. In the world I controlled, and word of my sudden trip to London, my abandoned meetings, and my daily visits to a graphic designer's flat in Clapham traveled faster than most. Within 2 weeks, the rival organizations who had spent 5 years circling my empire like sharks smelling old blood learned something they considered far more valuable than any business secret. Tyran Han had a daughter with no security detail, no bodyguards, no protection at all, living in an ordinary London flat with an ordinary lock on the door. The first warning came quietly. A black car parked outside Serafina's building for 3 nights in a row, never approaching, simply watching. Unsol flagged it within hours of being told to monitor the street. I didn't wait for a second warning. "You're coming to Seoul," I told Serafina over the phone, urgency in my voice I hadn't carried since before the shooting. "Both of you, tonight if I can arrange it." "Tyran, I have clients, I have a business, I can't just—" "Someone is watching your building," I said. The line went silent. "I'm not asking you to depend on me," I said quickly, before she could refuse on instinct. "I'm asking you to let me protect our daughter while you figure out what you want to do about everything else. Bring your laptop. Bring your work. Run your business from Seoul if you have to. I'm not trying to take anything from you, I'm trying to keep her safe." She was quiet for a long moment. Exhaustion and fear, and 5 years of fierce independence all warring inside her at once. "Okay," she said finally. "For her, not for me." "I understand," I told her. The Han family estate sat on a hillside overlooking the Han River, all glass walls and marble floors, and a silence so complete it had once made me feel powerful. Watching Hyle run through the front hallway in her socks, sliding across the polished marble like it was an ice rink, I realized that silence had never been peace. It had only ever been emptiness wearing an expensive disguise. Within 3 days, that emptiness was gone entirely. Hyle claimed the East Wing study as her personal art studio and covered the windows in star and fox stickers. She found a closet of old family portraits and, with the focused dedication of a true artist, drew small curling mustaches on 3 generations of stern-faced Han ancestors using a permanent marker she absolutely was not supposed to have access to. "They look happier now," she explained to a horrified staff member who discovered the damage. "You're welcome," she taught my youngest soldier, and another junior guard, a serious young man named Ji-won, an entire dance routine from a children's show, promising both of them cookies as payment. Ji-won, a man who had once disarmed an attacker twice his size without breaking a sweat, found himself practicing the routine in the garden at her insistence, utterly defeated by a 6-year-old's negotiating skills. By the end of the first week, the entire household staff, and the security detail, and even Hajun himself, had taken to quietly calling me Mr. Grumpy Eyebrows whenever I wasn't in the room, a nickname Hyel had coined on day 2 and refused to abandon. Serafina, true to her word, refused every offer of luxury I extended. She declined the credit card I tried to set up in her name. She declined the offer to fund her business with capital. She kept her laptop open at the kitchen table every morning, designing logos and brand packages for clients in London who had no idea she was now working from a billionaire's mansion in Seoul. "I survived 5 years without your money," she told me plainly. "The first week when I pushed slightly too hard. I'm not starting to depend on it now. I'm not trying to buy you," I said. "I know, but old habits make me nervous. Let me keep my independence," she said, without looking up from her screen. "It's the only thing that kept me standing all this time." I respected it, even when it frustrated me. And watching her continue to build her career from my dining room table, refusing every shortcut, only deepened something I had thought was already as deep as it could go. The danger arrived on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after we had settled into the estate. Hyel had insisted on a walk through the private garden before dinner, dragging my youngest guard along to admire what she called her secret flower kingdom, a corner of rose bushes she had claimed as her own territory. Serafina and I followed a few steps behind, deep in conversation about Hyel's school enrollment, when the first gunshot cracked through the evening air. Everything happened in seconds. My youngest man grabbed Hyel and pulled her down behind a stone planter before the second shot rang out. Hajun appeared from nowhere, weapon drawn, shouting coordinates into a radio. I threw my body in front of Serafina, pressing her against the garden wall, my heart pounding harder than it had in 5 years. The exchange lasted less than 90 seconds. 2 of the attackers were subdued by my team. A third escaped over the back wall before backup could reach him. When the smoke cleared, no one in my family had been hit, though one of the rose bushes Hyel had claimed as her kingdom now had a bullet hole through its center, a casualty she mourned dramatically for the rest of the evening. But the fear that settled over the household that night had nothing dramatic about it at all. Serafina found me alone on the balcony outside my study hours later, long after Hyel had finally fallen asleep clutching a stuffed fox tighter than usual. "You should have told me it could get this dangerous," she said, arms crossed against the cold night air. "I told you someone was watching the building," I said. "You told me it was a precaution, not that we'd be dodging bullets in a garden 3 weeks later." I didn't argue, I couldn't. "You're right," I said. "I should have told you everything." "Then tell me now." I turned to face her fully, the city lights of Seoul glittering below us, and for the first time since I'd shown up soaked at her door, I let her see all of it. I pulled back my collar, exposing the tattoos climbing my neck. I unbuttoned my cuff and rolled up my sleeve, revealing ink wrapped around old faded scars. "Each one means something," I said quietly. "Each one represents someone I failed to protect, a man on my team who didn't come home, a rival I had no choice but to eliminate before he eliminated me, a version of myself I had to bury so the rest of me could survive." She stepped closer, her fingers tracing lightly over one tattoo near a faint scar on my collarbone, careful, almost reverent. "This one," she said softly. "What does this one mean?" "That's the day I woke up from the coma," I said. "The day my mother told me you were gone. I had it done a month later. I wanted something permanent to remind me never to trust easily again." I looked at her, the city lights catching in her eyes. "I don't want another name carved into my skin because I failed to protect it," I told her. "I want you and Hyel to be the reason I stop adding to this list, not another entry on it." She didn't answer with words. The rain that had started lightly while we spoke had grown heavier, slicking the marble floor, and when she took a step toward me, her shoes slid against the wet stone. She gasped, losing her balance for half a second, and I caught her, one arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her against my chest before she could fall. Neither of us moved. The rain fell around us, soaking through both our clothes. "I know," I said. Their lips met before either of us consciously decided it should happen. 5 years of grief and longing finally crashing into something neither of us could keep denying any longer. The kiss was slow at first, careful, like we were both afraid the moment would shatter if we moved too quickly. Then it deepened, years of separation pouring into seconds, the rain falling around us, as if the sky itself had been waiting just as long as we had. From the balcony above, hidden just out of sight, Hyle, who absolutely should not have been peeking at that hour, grinned so wide her whole face nearly disappeared into the expression. Finally she whispered to herself, exactly like she'd whispered through the locked kitchen door weeks earlier, and tiptoed back to bed, satisfied that her master plan, 3 months in the making by her own generous estimate, had finally succeeded. The attack in the garden changed something in me I couldn't undo, even if I'd wanted to. Danger had always been part of my life. I'd accepted that the day I took over my father's empire. But danger circling Serafina and Hyle felt different. It felt like a clock ticking somewhere I couldn't see, counting down toward a loss I refused to risk. I decided I wasn't going to wait for tomorrow to be guaranteed. 3 weeks after the kiss on the balcony, I found Serafina in the garden again, this time stake to help it heal. "It's going to make it," she said without looking up, sensing me approach. "Stubborn little thing. It takes after the people living here," I said. She laughed softly and stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "What's wrong? You have your serious face on. The one Hyle says is probably illegal." I almost smiled, but the weight of what I'd come to say held it back. "I've already lost 5 years," I said. 5 years I should have spent watching her grow up. 5 years I should have spent next to you. I can't get those back no matter how much I want to. But I'm not willing to lose one more day pretending I don't know exactly what I want. I reached into my coat and pulled out a small box, plain. No extravagant wrapping, nothing that screamed wealth the way most things in my world did. "I'm not going to give you some speech I rehearsed in front of a mirror," I said. "I'm only going to tell you the truth. I love you. I loved you 5 years ago. And somehow, even after everything that happened, I love you more now. I want every year I have left to belong to you and to her. Marry me, Serafina. Not because of the danger, not because it's convenient, because I don't want to spend one more sunrise without knowing you're both mine to protect." Serafina stared at the small box, then at me, tears already gathering before she'd said a word. "You said no extravagant gestures," she said, half laughing, half crying. "I kept the promise. No flowers, no grand display, just honesty. That's the most extravagant thing you could have given me," she whispered, and opened the box to find a simple ring, elegant but not showy. Exactly the kind of thing she would have chosen for herself if money had never entered the equation. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Tyran." From the upstairs window, where she had absolutely not been spying despite every appearance to the contrary, Hyle pumped her fist into the air in silent victory and immediately ran to tell my youngest guard, who pretended to be surprised despite having already placed a small bet with Jiwon on exactly which week the proposal would happen. Seoul had seen extravagant weddings before. It had never seen one quite like this. The ceremony took place on the grounds of our estate, transformed for one evening into something neither cold nor sterile, draped instead in warm gold lighting, white floral arrangements, and a guest list that mixed Seoul's most prominent business families with people Serafina had once worked alongside in London, all seated under careful, watchful security that most of them never noticed at all. I wore an elegant black tuxedo, my collar left intentionally open just enough to let the edge of my neck tattoo show, a small but deliberate statement that I was done hiding pieces of myself for anyone's comfort. Serafina walked down the aisle in a flowing white gown, simple and modern, her curls loose around her shoulders, looking every bit like a woman who had earned this moment through years of quiet strength rather than luck. Hyle, dressed in white with a basket of rose petals clutched in both hands, marched down the aisle ahead of her mother with the seriousness of a soldier carrying out a critical mission, forgetting almost immediately where the petals were supposed to go. Instead of scattering them gracefully along the aisle the way she'd practiced exactly twice the day before, she walked directly up to me at the altar, looked up with great determination, and dumped the entire basket of petals over my head and shoulders. The guests gasped, then burst into laughter as rose petals rained down over my tuxedo, several sticking to my shoulders. One balanced precariously in my hair. "There," Heil announced to the stunned crowd, hands on her hips, completely satisfied with her work. "Now he matches the flowers." I looked down at my daughter, petals scattered everywhere, and for the first time in front of an audience of nearly 300 people, I laughed. A real laugh, deep and unguarded, the kind no one in that room had ever seen from me before. The reception unfolded in our estate's grand hall. Warm lighting and long tables filled with both traditional Korean dishes and a few items Serafina had specifically requested, a small but meaningful gesture that made her feel less like a guest in someone else's culture, and more like she belonged exactly where she was standing. Midway through the evening, before the first dance had even begun, Hyul climbed onto a chair beside the head table, grabbed the microphone meant for the best man's toast before anyone could stop her, and tapped it twice to make sure it was working. "Hi," she said cheerfully as the room turned to watch. "I just want to say something." I reached for the microphone, half amused, half nervous about what might come out of my daughter's mouth next. She swatted my hand away without breaking eye contact with her audience. "My mommy cried because of him," she announced, her small voice carrying clearly through the speakers. The room went quiet. "But now she smiles because of him too," Heil finished, beaming. "So I think it worked out okay." The end. She handed the microphone back to a stunned best man and hopped down from the chair as if she hadn't just delivered the most emotionally devastating toast of the entire evening. There wasn't a dry eye left in the ballroom. Serafina pressed both hands to her face, tears streaming freely, and I pulled my new wife and daughter both into my arms at once, not caring that 300 guests were watching, not caring about anything except the two people standing in front of me, who had somehow found their way back into my life against every possible odd. My mother did not attend her son's wedding. She sat instead in her private study at the far end of the estate, watching the celebration from a distance. Through a tall window, jade bracelets clicking softly against her wrist as she turned a teacup in her hands without drinking from it. 5 years of careful manipulation had unraveled in a matter of weeks, and she was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly. She spent the following month doing what she had always done best, working in the shadows. She reached out to old contacts in the National Assembly, men who owed my late father favors stretching back decades, and quietly suggested an investigation into Hans Sterling's overseas holdings might prove politically useful. She leaked carefully selected half-truths to 2 financial journalists known for chasing scandal first and verifying facts second. She hired a lawyer to challenge Heil's place in the family trust, arguing that a child born outside Korea to a foreign mother carried no rightful claim to anything bearing the Han name. Every attempt failed. The politicians she approached were quietly informed, through channels I had cultivated over a decade of careful relationship building, that supporting baseless investigations against Hans Sterling would carry consequences far less comfortable than whatever favor my mother believed she was owed. The journalists, when they reached out for comment, were met not with denial, but with my own legal team presenting the fully documented truth: hospital records, intercepted letters, hidden pregnancy confirmations, everything laid out plainly enough that any story built on my mother's version of events collapsed before it ever reached print. The lawyer withdrew his filing within a week, after I personally visited his office and reminded him, calmly and without raising my voice once, exactly whose family he'd chosen to work against. The final reckoning came on a quiet Thursday morning when I called an emergency meeting of the Hans Sterling board, the first such meeting my mother had not been informed about in over 15 years. She arrived anyway, alerted by a sympathetic board member, storming into the glass-walled conference room mid-session, her composure cracking for the first time I had ever witnessed. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "I built half of what this company is. I protected this family for 30 years. You protected your version of this family, I said, standing slowly from the head of the table. The version where you decide who I love, who raises my children, and which truths I'm allowed to know. That family doesn't exist anymore. Everything I did for you, she said. You stole 5 years of my life and called it protection, I said. My voice level, controlled, the same voice that had once made enemies surrender without a fight. I am removing you effective today from every position you hold within this company. From the board, from the family trust, from any authority over decisions affecting my wife or my children. This is not revenge, Mother. This is the only way I know to make sure you never do to anyone else what you did to us. She stood frozen at the end of the table, the entire board watching in stunned silence, as the woman who had ruled this empire's quieter operations for 3 decades was, in the span of a single sentence, stripped of everything she had spent her life building. You're choosing them over your own blood, she said finally, her voice breaking for the first time. They are my own blood, I said quietly. You're the one who chose power over family first. I'm simply choosing differently than you did. She left the building that day without another word, and though I would in time allow her limited, carefully supervised contact with her grandchildren, the empire she had spent her life protecting through lies and manipulation never returned to her hands again. With the threat finally dismantled, the estate that had once felt like a museum slowly transformed into something that actually resembled a home. Serafina redecorated room by room, replacing cold marble accents with warm textiles, filling empty hallways with family photographs that had never existed in this house before, hanging Heil's drawings in frames alongside artwork the family had owned for generations, refusing to treat one as more valuable than the other. Heil, given full creative license over at least 2 rooms of the mansion, instituted what she proudly called the no grumpy faces rule, a policy she explained with great seriousness to the household staff during a family meeting she organized entirely on her own initiative. If you get caught frowning during dinner, she announced, standing on a chair so everyone could see her properly, you have to tell one embarrassing story about yourself. No exceptions, not even for Dad. Especially not for Dad, Serafina added, smirking. The rule became a beloved tradition within weeks. Even Hajun, once nicknamed Mr. Refrigerator, found himself confessing one evening that he'd cried during a children's cartoon about a lost puppy, a story that left the entire dinner table in tears of laughter. The night the rule finally caught me, Heil pointed an accusing finger across the table with the triumph of a prosecutor who had just won an unwinnable case. You frowned. I saw it. Tell us something embarrassing. I did not frown. You did. Your eyebrows did the angry squeeze thing. Tell us a story or it's not fair. I sighed, defeated by a 6-year-old yet again, and admitted with great reluctance that I had once fainted during a routine school vaccination at age 9, collapsing directly onto the school nurse and knocking over an entire tray of supplies in the process. Serafina laughed so hard she had to set down her chopsticks, and Heil fell out of her chair entirely, gasping for breath. The scary Mafia boss, she wheezed, fainted from a tiny needle. It was a very large needle, I said, with as much dignity as I could manage. It was not, Hajun called from the end of the table, unable to resist. I've seen the medical file, standard size. The table erupted again, and watching my wife laugh until she couldn't breathe and my daughter roll on the floor in delighted hysterics, I found myself laughing right along with them, fully, openly, without the slightest concern for the image I'd spent a decade carefully protecting. Somewhere in that laughter, in that warm, chaotic dining room filled with people who had once been strangers and were now simply my family, I finally understood that I had won something far more valuable than any business deal or territorial victory my old world had ever offered me. Years passed the way years do when a family finally stops surviving and starts living. 2 years into our marriage, the mansion filled with new sound entirely, the cries of twin babies, a boy and a girl born on a stormy October night that had me pacing the hospital hallway so anxiously that Serafina, exhausted and in labor, still found the energy to tell me to sit down before I wore a hole through the floor tiles. We named the twins Kanun and Duha, and within months, Hyle, now 8 years old and fiercely proud of her new role, declared herself Assistant Big Sister, a title she insisted be taken with complete seriousness. "I'm in charge of teaching them important things," she informed us solemnly, holding baby Duha with surprising gentleness for a child who treated nearly everything else in life with chaotic enthusiasm, like how to negotiate with bodyguards and which desserts are secretly the best ones, even if the menu says otherwise. "That sounds like valuable curriculum," I said, fighting a smile. "I know. I designed it myself." A year later, a third child arrived, a girl we named Yin, completing a household that had once known only silence and now rarely experienced a quiet moment at all. Serafina's career, far from disappearing into motherhood, grew into something larger than she'd ever imagined. Her small design studio, originally built on her name alone, expanded into a full creative agency with offices in both London and Seoul, eventually landing contracts with luxury brands across Asia and Europe that had nothing to do with my wealth, and everything to do with her own talent and reputation. She made a point, every time a journalist asked about her success, of correcting the assumption that marrying into my family had opened those doors. "I built this before he ever found us again," she told one particularly persistent reporter. "He didn't open any doors for me. I kicked them open myself, a long time before he came back into the picture. I spent those same years dismantling, piece by piece, the underground empire my father had built and I had once ruled without question. Quietly, carefully, I converted criminal operations into legitimate businesses, technology investments, logistics companies, renewable energy ventures, each transition handled with the same precision I'd once used to protect territory that no longer interested me. I kept the loyalty of men like Hajun and my youngest guard, who transitioned alongside me into legitimate corporate security roles, their old skills repurposed for protection rather than violence. Together, Serafina and I established a foundation dedicated to supporting single parents, funding scholarships for children growing up without one parent present, and rebuilding communities that organized crime had once exploited rather than served. Our first major project funded a community center in the same Seoul neighborhood where my father had once run his earliest operations, a deliberate act of repair that brought me to tears the day it opened, something I never would have admitted publicly 5 years earlier. Success arrived in forms that mattered and forms that simply looked impressive on paper. Magazine covers featured our family more than once, usually focusing on Serafina's design empire or the foundation's growing impact, occasionally mentioning, almost as an afterthought, the dramatic story of how we had found our way back to each other. Awards filled a shelf in my study I rarely looked at twice. Our combined wealth multiplied well beyond what either of us had possessed individually, though neither of us spoke about it often, and neither of us let it change how we moved through the world. What mattered most, what we spoke about constantly, remained far simpler than any award or magazine cover. Movie nights crowded onto the largest sofa in the house, all 5 of us piled together under blankets while Hyle, self-appointed remote control manager, argued passionately for whatever animated film she decided was currently the best one available. Family breakfasts on Sunday mornings, loud and chaotic, twins banging spoons against high chairs while Yin demanded to be lifted up to see what everyone else was eating, pillow fights that started as innocent bedtime routines and ended with feathers scattered across an entire hallway, much to the household staff's quiet despair and my secret delight. Hyle had not abandoned her favorite nickname for me, despite my many attempts over the years to retire it permanently. "Mr. Grumpy Eyebrows," she called out cheerfully one evening, watching me frown slightly over a business report at the dinner table. "I am working, Haya. You're frowning. That's basically the same thing as breaking the no grumpy faces rule. That rule does not apply to legitimate business concerns. It applies to everything. I wrote the rule. I get to interpret it. Serafina, watching the exchange with the same amusement she'd carried through every version of this argument over the years, simply shook her head and reached for her tea. "You're not going to win this one," she told me. "You haven't won it once in 4 years. I don't know why you keep trying." "Hope," I said dryly, closing the report I'd given up on entirely. Apparently I still have some left. Even my own employees, men and women who worked across Han Sterling's gleaming 38-story tower, had long since adopted the nickname behind my back, a fact I had discovered entirely by accident when I overheard 2 junior analysts using it in the elevator. Completely unaware, I stood directly behind them. I cleared my throat once, watched both employees turn pale with horror, and simply said, "Carry on," before stepping off at my floor, deciding the battle against that nickname had been lost long ago and was no longer worth fighting. I had, after everything, finally accepted defeat, and found, much to my own surprise, that losing this particular fight felt remarkably like winning something far better. 11 years after a 6-year-old girl in yellow sneakers fell asleep on a stranger's shoulder, our family boarded another international flight together, this time bound for London, where Serafina's design studio was opening a new flagship office, and the entire family had insisted on attending the launch as one unit. This time no one sat alone in business class. This time no empty seat needed protecting from strangers who feared the man sitting beside it. Hyle, 17 now, tall and sharp-witted, claimed the window seat with the same confidence she'd once used to claim the seat beside a terrifying Mafia boss she didn't yet know was her father. The twins, 9 years old, and constantly competing over absolutely everything, argued cheerfully over who would get to sit beside their father for takeoff, a debate I settled by suggesting Kanun take the seat for takeoff and Duha take it for landing, a compromise that satisfied neither child completely but ended the argument regardless. Chi-Yin, the youngest at 6, simply climbed into my lap without asking permission from anyone. The same fearless confidence her older sister had once shown a stranger on a different flight entirely. Surrounded on all sides by children fighting for space against me, I happily lost every argument about personal space I might once have cared about. Midway through the flight, Hyle glanced across the aisle and noticed a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9, traveling alone, glancing nervously at the unfamiliar cabin around him. Clearly uneasy about the long journey ahead without a parent nearby, she nudged me gently. "Dad, look!" I followed her gaze, understanding immediately without needing further explanation. I unbuckled my seatbelt, walked the short distance across the aisle, and crouched down beside the boy's seat with the same easy warmth I'd learned over 11 years to offer freely instead of guarding so carefully. "First time flying alone?" I asked. The boy nodded, clutching his backpack tightly. "It's not so bad," I told him. "I once sat next to a stranger on a flight like this who completely changed my entire life. You never know who you'll end up sitting beside." The boy managed a small, uncertain smile, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "If you get scared," I added, "or you just want someone to talk to, we're right across the aisle. My daughter over there once gave a stranger a cookie because she thought his coffee looked lonely. I'm sure she'd happily do the same for you." "I would," Hyle called over, grinning. "I have an entire bag of snacks. It's basically a public service." The boy laughed properly this time, and by the time we began our descent into London hours later, he'd spent nearly an hour in animated conversation with Hyle about a video game neither of his parents understood, while I watched with quiet satisfaction, remembering exactly what one unexpected conversation on a plane like this had once given me. Serafina reached over and laced her fingers through mine as we settled back into our seats. "You're thinking about it," she said. "That flight, always," I said. "Every time I get on a plane." "Good," she said softly, resting her head against my shoulder. The same gesture our daughter had once offered me without either of us knowing what it would unravel. "Don't ever stop thinking about it." London welcomed us with mild autumn sunshine, a rare gift the city didn't often offer, and the studio launch that evening drew a crowd far larger than Serafina had originally anticipated. Journalists and clients and old friends from her earliest, hardest years building a career from nothing, all gathered to celebrate a milestone that represented more than just business success. After the formal event wound down, we flew back to Seoul 2 days later for a smaller, quieter celebration with extended family and the household staff, who over more than a decade had become something closer to family themselves than employees. Hajun, grayer now but no less devoted, raised a toast that nearly brought the entire table to tears, recalling with surprising eloquence, for a man who rarely spoke more than necessary, the exact moment 11 years earlier when a little girl in yellow sneakers had renamed him Mr. Refrigerator and changed the entire trajectory of everyone's lives in that room without even realizing it. My mother, present but seated at a respectful distance, watched her grandchildren with an expression that had softened considerably over the years, though the road to even this limited reconciliation had been long and required more humility from her than she'd ever shown before. She would never fully understand why I had chosen what I chose, but she had slowly learned to accept it. And on nights like this, watching 3 grandchildren she'd nearly cost herself the chance to know, she found something resembling peace in simply being allowed to witness their happiness from a respectful distance. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the children had finally, reluctantly gone to bed, Serafina and I stood once more on the same balcony where everything had truly begun. The rain long gone, the sky clear and full of stars over the Han River. 11 years, Serafina said quietly. 11 years, I repeated. Do you ever wonder what would have happened, she asked, if she hadn't wandered down that aisle? Every day, I admitted. I think about it every single day. I picture how easily I could have spent the rest of my life believing a lie, never knowing either of you existed, building an empire that meant nothing because there was no one left to share it with. Serafina leaned into me, the same way she had 11 years earlier, the same way our daughter once had on an airplane, neither of them expecting to change anything at all. She saved us, Serafina whispered. She did, I agreed, just by falling asleep. The next morning, the entire family gathered in the garden for breakfast. The rose bush that had once taken a bullet had grown thick and wild, climbing along the stone wall in full, defiant bloom, a small living monument to everything we had survived and rebuilt. Hyle, stretched out on a garden bench with the lazy confidence of a teenager who knew exactly how much influence she still held over the household, looked up from her phone and grinned at both of us. You know, she said, if I hadn't fallen asleep on Dad's shoulder that day, you two would probably still be acting stubborn. The whole table laughed, the twins not entirely understanding the joke, but laughing anyway because everyone else was, Chi-yin demanding an explanation nobody bothered giving her properly. I reached over and kissed my wife's forehead, the same easy affection that had once felt impossible to imagine for a man the world had called cold and unreachable for 5 long years. Serafina leaned into me exactly the way she always had, exactly the way she always would. The children raced across the garden, weaving between rose bushes and old marble statues, their laughter echoing off walls that had once known only silence and suspicion, now filled permanently with noise that meant something far better than peace ever could have meant alone. I have learned, in the years since that flight, that destiny doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand announcements. Sometimes it doesn't knock loudly at all. Sometimes it simply walks down an airplane aisle in bright yellow sneakers, places a single cookie on a stranger's tray, and falls asleep on a shoulder that had been waiting, without even knowing it, for somewhere safe to finally rest. And if there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this to carry with them, it is this: loyalty given freely, even by the smallest hands, can undo the damage that power and blood and years of silence never could.